Okay, I just want to go over some of the basics of Mesh right now. So what we're going to do is I've made this scene file. It's very simple. I just made a simple ground plane. And then there's a cube. And you can see the cube is exactly at origin right now. It's at a scale of like 1.5-ish. So what you can do is basically the simplest thing is you want to create a mesh network using this cube. So basically that means you're going to be scattering this cube in whatever fashion that you want. So you select the object that you want, go to Mesh, create Mesh Network, open up the little dialog box. So I did this through Mesh and then hit the square, but you can also go over here. You can see create Mesh Network. What I like about going into here, create Mesh Network with the square, is you actually get more choices right off the bat, but anything that you do in here, you can later do in the Mesh Network itself. So again, so you got this dialog box and you got two choices. You have Mesh and Instancer. And what happens is Mesh is basically just going to duplicate this mesh, and an Instancer is going to instance this cube. So let's do Mesh first. And basically down here you have a distribution type, and all of this can be changed afterwards. So this is linear, radial, grid, there's a whole bunch, but you'll see once we make it, you can change it afterwards. And then another thing is hide your source object after creating the mesh network. So what it'll do, it'll hide the cube in the outliner and then just show your scattered geometry instead. So let's do apply and close. And what you can see, if I just turn off the grid right now, you can see that Mesh automatically turned off the cube, the original group, and then basically now you can see we have a Mesh node. If you select it, here's all the inputs that I showed in one of the images on the blog page. And what Mesh did is it created a distribute node, which is what we selected, which is linear. And then you've got a Mesh repro. So basically right here, the object's right here. And what you can see is there's the object that we sourced, pcube1. And basically this is being live geo. So there's the repro, basically the reprojection mesh right here. And you can see there's basically 10 of them. And if we go back into the mesh distribute, the default when we made the distribute was 10. So you can basically slide this down to any number that you want. You can go even higher than 100. You can input as much as you want. But as you can tell right here, the spacing is overlapping, and that's because you have other parameters down below. Right now, everything is being created at a distance of 20. So right now, there's a 20 unit distance between each cube, basically. And then you can even do it in Y. You can go negative as well. Z. And then rotate. So even within this node, there's already a bunch of things that you can have really good command of. And then back to the distribution type. So basically that's what we were talking about. Here we go, that we're radial. So we're in a circular motion. If we go in and fill in a circle. And you can see here, since we're using mesh, like afterwards, you could bake this down and use this to keep changing the topology and create more complex objects. And let's see, so radio, spherical. Spherical is similar in that sense. Everything's going to be built up within a sphere of this shape. So here all these cubes are now forming a sphere as they coalesce. Now you can, again, there's different attributes that you can do. You can have it go 360, not. You can change the angle in Y. So there is really a lot. Radius, make it more packed, more spread out. There's a lot. And then animation speed, you can animate this, the timing, all kinds of stuff. So it is relatively strong in terms of what you can do with something very, very simple. There's a whole bunch here that I won't get into, volume, particles, stuff like that. The other one that I will mention is the mesh. So basically, you can now attach or have this scatter across any piece of geometry that you want. So that's where we want our ground. So if I shift H, go back into the mesh network and the input mesh. If I middle mouse click on ground and drag it over, now it's going to scatter across my ground plane. I have a whole lot in here, so it's kind of hard to see. But what you can see now is basically at that parameter it's scattering. And then we can increase or decrease. And you can see like it's very quick. It's very live in the render view. Now the other thing that you can see here, I haven't turned off right now. I set up a simple dome light. I like to be using Redshift these days, so I just have an HDR image. So if you want, we can just render real quick. And there you go. Took 2 seconds to render. There's a little bit of artifacts on what the parameters are, but you get immediate feedback for what you're trying to do with your geometry. So what else can we do? I'm just going to hide the dome light for simplicity right now. So what else can you do? So what I want to show next is basically right here. If I hover over this, this is the mesh editor. So if I click that, that brings up a nice little editor. So it's a little like consolidated space that shows everything within your mesh setup. And there's different marquee buttons that you can hover over and kind of tell you what they do, or they're supposed to. There you go. You can switch the mesh geotype, cache the mesh network, create mesh from points. Here it calls up the mesh parameters itself. Here it goes to the mesh repo node. So there's just a hot toggle key. But if you see here the distribute node that's in our group right now, you can see it right there. And then basically what's nice is they're kind of like layers in Photoshop. The more mesh networks that you actually create and nodes, then you can turn them all off, turn them on, and really just quickly see what's happening to what you're affecting in your scene. And then also you can right click and just delete the whole network. You can duplicate the network, and then you can label them and rename the mesh network. So you can have multiple mesh networks within here. So let's go back to the mesh, and then here you see all the choices that we have. But let me show you something before we go too deep with the geometry. So if you notice the geometry that we have, the original cube, the pivot point is in the center. And what happens with the mesh network is that's how it's going to position our object, is where the pivot point rests. So all our cubes are centered right now at that center point as they're distributed across this plane. So to change that, you can move the pivot point. So if we go back to the original cube, what you can see here, which is actually kind of nice too, there's a live connection between all our geometry. So if I scale up the original cube, all my other mesh cubes fall in line. So they're all linked in that sense. So now if I just hit insert, and if I want to move the pivot point down and hit insert again, now you can see I've moved the pivot point, but none of my mesh node network has moved yet. Let me get it so I can see it. So the pivot point is a little too low, so let me do that, insert. And then basically you can still see that it hasn't live updated. And what we want to do is we want to go to modify and bake the pivot point. So we want to keep the object at origin, because when it scatters, it's going to use the pivot point for where it places the object. So if the object itself is further away from origin, that can cause problems. So all we did was bake the pivot point, and now you can see everything updated. So now all our cubes are based on the new pivot point, and they're all rising above onto the geometry where we placed it. So that's pretty cool. Let's go and see. Send back to the mesh or the repo mesh. What you can also see here is this object has an object ID, and right now that is 0. And what is interesting is basically you can add more objects within everything. So I basically grabbed and dragged the torus and the pyramid over into the Mash repro. But what you're seeing is nothing is actually changing. So we're not seeing those objects. So if we go into the Mash network again and we click on ID node, so now we have an ID node and basically everything swaps out. So this is where we can change out what objects are there. And basically we have an ID count of 3. If we go down to 2, we're going to lose one of the objects. And if we go down to 1, we're back to the square. So 2 brings in the torus and 3 brings in the pyramid. And if I just hide our original objects, you can see. And it just basically, based on that Mash ID node, it basically will include whatever you want. So there's linear, random, cycle, fixed. And you can have a little bit more fun with these, random seed aspects and stuff like that. So that's just something to play with. So random, you're basically going to randomly generate amongst these seeds, amongst these IDs. And then you can do a random seed amongst that. So now there's, changing the variety amongst the objects. You got a random seed factor, which is cool. And then basically you can go to cycle. Again, the random seed factor. But what cycle will do is actually animate. So it's going to cycle through various things that we've got with the random seed and the cycle gap and then the time. So you can really just start messing with what is this going to do. And then the last one is fixed, which basically it's a fixed ID. So you're literally telling Maya which object to populate. As simple as that. So what is really cool is basically now if you look here, you got the ID, you got the distribute nodes in our Mash editor. And again, like Photoshop, these elements start stacking up and acting together or against. So it can be really powerful once you start figuring out how you're going to build up your Mash networks and what will they do. Now the other thing I should mention is how that these got populated. And if we go back to the Mash ID, so we have the ID count up to 3. And if you look into the Mash repro node, it all goes by what I dragged in first. So the first one is 0, and that's the cube. The next one is the torus, 1, and then the pyramid, 2. And that's how Mash creates the system. Now, you can see here, you can just drag and drop how they fall in layers, basically. So that is important because that will stick with it. So now I've moved torus and that is going to be 0. Cube is now 1. So it is very quick, very easy to maneuver and change things in Mash, which I find very nice. And you get an automatic display of everything. So very, for the most part, intuitive. And then very fast. Look at that. It already renders in Redshift. So we're at 2 seconds still. Alright, what else? So the other thing that we talked about is basically these are live geo the way we had it. That's where you get the repro mesh. So what we want to do is we can convert this back to an instance or just from the get-go create it as an instance. Okay, and then like we said here, we can easily switch from the repro mesh. So if we go into our Mash editor and we check here, switch Mash geometry type. Click, and you can see here it went from the mesh to now the instancer. And if we go into the mesh instancer, it still has the same ID number 012. So it does keep that connection between your original objects. So now everything in here is an instanced object. Okay, and let's see what else. So I don't want to make this video too long. I just want this to be an introductory level of this, but there is some cool things. All of these different nodes basically add a different parameter. So dynamics, you could add color, you can add a curve, audio file. So you could have an audio file that basically derives how the objects scatter. Orientation, you have an individual placer node, which is cool, so you can hand place every single node that you want. Let's do something very simple with like random. So we're going to add a random node, and then here you can see there's the random node, and what it does basically it gives you an orientation right off the bat. So right here you have an X position, a Y, a Z, so you can see it's like an offset. So whatever your object was already scattered, it's going to offset it. But it's nice within here, you can basically do random 360 degree add. So now everything's going to, as it scatters, is going to be rotated. You could rotate on a different axis, let's say up to 45 degrees. So everything will have that relationship. You can go negative as well. I guess you can't go negative for that. Let's see. And then you get an instant visualization of everything that's going on. And then scale. So you can, have these scale out individually in different, parameters. Really break the geometry in that sense. But then you have a uniform scale. So if you click uniform scale, everything's going to scale together. So this is a little misleading. Now they're no longer, separate, but what you will see is they are basing everything off the first field. So the X is where we're deriving the scale factor. So if we're going to scale up to a factor of 1, and then obviously you'll have a randomization from the original object to a scale of 1. These parameters now do nothing. So it takes its hierarchy from the first field. And then you have a random seed generator, so you can just kind of influence it a little bit. Take it down. And then again, what's nice, this layer can be turned off, it can be turned on. We can drag these down. So all of it off. So it's really nice just to kind of get all these different parameters. There's a strength. So the strength is basically kind of, you think about it, like layers. Most of these nodes all have a strength field within them. So like distribute, there's the random seed or strength right here. So you have all the different parameters, and then there's the strength. So what you want to think of it is in terms of like a layer, it's like the opacity. So how much will this node affect everything in your mesh network? So it's going way down, so there's hardly any influence, and then full influence. So in that sense, it's kind of nice. Like you can put your major positions on things, and then you could start to dial it in a little bit more depending on how much you want the fields to be affected. Let's go back to the main mesh node. And yeah, I mean, all kinds of things. Like curve is interesting. You can basically draw a curve and then have the objects follow along that curve and use that curve as a parameter. Yeah, so maybe this is good just for the introduction. I'd say, definitely start just exploring and trying different things within here. And I'll do a further MASH part 2 to really enhance what we're going over, because there's really a lot of neat things, especially when we get down to world. World is really unique and complex, but basically, in a sense, you can be creating using like an ecosystem. So I consider it kind of similar or akin to Eon's Vu, where you can have a population of an ecosystem within whatever mesh or whatever geometry you want. And all kinds of like additive elements to start really driving some complex parameters. So hope you like this introduction, and I'll do some follow-ups.